Good morning. Pastor Matthew here again on Monday morning. Thanks for joining me today. This week, I'm going to be doing not every weekday, but my plan is to be with you all on Monday, Wednesday, and Friday here on Facebook Live. And you know that we're going through slowly the book of Ruth. We went through verses 1 through 18 last week, and we began the story of Ruth, which remember is a story about suffering. And it's a story really for anyone who's trying to reconcile the evil of this world with the love of God. As I've been telling you, there's a man named Samuel Johnson who says people need to be reminded much more often than they need to be instructed. And so that's why I'm reminding you of the truths that we went through in the book of Ruth several years ago. Now, last week we asked a couple questions. First, is God still the king when tragedy strikes? And we saw, yes, he is. He's still guiding and providing. He did that for Ruth and for Naomi. And then we also looked at the question of what happens with faith in suffering, and we saw that faith commits to those who suffer, even when it has nothing to gain. This week we're going to continue. We're in verses 19 through 22 today of chapter 1, and we're looking at one word, interpretation. Ruth and Naomi finally show back up in Bethlehem, and we see that Naomi has a very particular interpretation of the events of what's happening and what's happened to her. She comes back and people welcome her to the city, but they say, is this Naomi? Is this the person that we knew from 10 plus years ago who left because of the famine? And she says, don't call me Naomi, call me Mara. And as we've seen, this is such a beautiful piece of literature. She's making a play on words there. Her name, Naomi, means pleasant, and Mara means bitter. And so she's giving herself a new name to reflect how it is she feels about these circumstances. And then she makes an interpretation of the events. Much like us, she's a storyteller, and she interprets the things that happen to her. So she says this in verses 20 and 21. Do not call me Naomi, call me Mara, for the Almighty has dealt very bitterly with me. I went away full, and the Lord has brought me back empty. Why call me Naomi when the Lord has testified against me and the Almighty has brought calamity upon me? So she doesn't just state the facts. She doesn't just state the fact that she's in suffering, but she also has this interpretation that God is actually against her. As she says, he's dealt bitterly with her, verse 20. And then in verse 21, he's testified against her. She believes somehow that God is opposed to her, that maybe she's done something wrong. Maybe she's fallen out of favor in some way. And this is a reminder for us as well in suffering. It can be tempting and easy to come to very drastic conclusions pretty quickly. And it can be tempting and easy to make interpretations without even realizing that's what we're doing. We just think we're stating the facts, right? Naomi probably thinks, yeah, this is obvious. God is against me. And yet if we step back for a second, we can realize that's just her way of looking at the events. That may not actually be what's going on here. The same, of course, is true for us, right? We make interpretations. Is God not giving us what we deserve? Maybe God doesn't actually exist. Maybe we've done something wrong and we need to search our hearts and figure out what it is. Now, of course, there are certain situations that as we've discussed when we went through the book of 1 Peter, where our sin does lead to suffering. But when we're looking at things like the death of a family member, famine, turn to. Naomi here says that she's bitter, and underneath that is this belief that God owes her something, maybe owes her something that he doesn't actually owe her. Maybe instead of a faulty interpretation, we have a lack of interpretation. Ourselves in busyness, constantly on social media trying to figure out the latest data and the latest information. Maybe we found a list of chores around the house. We're proud that we're not on social media, but we're just getting things done. Not realizing that busyness is a way of masking our own anxiety and hiding from the interpretations that we're afraid of. No matter what it is, interpretation's a challenge. It's a challenge for all of us in life and in suffering. And yet this story does not disappoint. It continues to be just a beautiful piece of literature, and it continues to be understated in the points that it makes. And it makes sort of an ironic point here. There's something that's true and there's something that's false. It's true in a sense that God has brought Naomi back empty. She doesn't have her husband. She doesn't have her sons. But it's also not true that the Lord is against her. And we see that in this very section. She makes this proclamation, verse 21, and then the very next verse, we see the ways that God is for her. Verse 22, so Naomi returned, and Ruth the Moabite, her daughter-in-law, with her. She has someone with her. She's not alone. God has provided a companion. And then that same verse, and they came to Bethlehem at the beginning of the barley harvest. So as Naomi's believing that God's against her, she's making this drastic interpretation. God is actually providing for her in that moment. He's provided her with a companion, and he's provided her with a place where there's a harvest, where the famine has ended. And so we need to be reminded, just as this passage shows us, that the presence does not mean the absence of God. And the presence of suffering does not mean that God is against us. In fact, he very may well be and is providing for us in the midst of that. We saw that yesterday in our sermon from Psalm 46. God is a very present help in trouble. And he's a very present help for Naomi in this passage, even as she wants her friends to call her Mara. We also note that she doesn't talk to God. Narrator doesn't say anything about it, but she doesn't even pray. And that may be an implicit criticism of her. We'll see prayers later in the book of Ruth. But for us this morning, I'd say this is a couple points of application. First, what are your interpretations? We're all interpretation makers, meaning makers. We want to find the meaning behind the events in life. What are the meanings that you're making? What do they say about you and about God? Naomi is not empty, and neither are we. And the reason that we're not empty is because God is with us, working and guiding and providing, as we've seen earlier in this chapter. And he's with us because of Jesus. Naomi states that she's gone from full to empty. And of course, it was Jesus that went from full to empty for us. He went from full of relationship with his Father to empty and separated on the cross. And so because of that, we can know no matter what our circumstances are, we are never truly empty. Because we always have God and his love for us. And we know that he's continuing to provide for us just as he's doing for Naomi. Thanks so much, and I look forward to seeing you all on Wednesday as we continue in the beginning of chapter 2 of the book of Ruth. Thanks so much. Bye.